World of Warcraft, Beyond the Dark Portal, by Aaron Rosenberg and Christy Golden. Chapter 11. Antonidas, Archmage and leader of the Kirin Tor, sat in his study examining a recently arrived scroll. The news was grave indeed. Admiral Proudmoore reported that a group of orcs had stolen several ships from Nathanael Harbor. Worse, when he pursued them, Proudmoore's ships had been driven back by dragons. Black dragons. Antonidas felt a vein throb in his temple and rubbed it. During the Second War, the Horde had somehow enlisted the aid of the Red Dragons, and now that the portal had been restored, it seemed they have allied with the Black Dragons as well. It was almost unbelievable. 2 dragonflights. How could the Lions hope to stand against that? A soft tap came from the door. "Enter, Krask," Antonidas called out. His magical skills already tell him who was calling at this late hour. "You left word you wished to see me," the other mage asked as he entered and closed the door behind him, keeping his delicate features deliberately bland. Antonidas suspected it was to stop him from losing his temper, but if so, it did not succeed. "Yes, I left word," Antonidas replied, all but spitting the words through his long gray streaking beard. "Months ago. Where have you been?" "I had other business to attend to," Krask answered evasively, perching himself on the edge of Antonidas' desk, lamplight causing the hints of red and black leaning in his silver hair turned the whole into fire and gleaming metal. "Other business? You serve on the Kirin Tor, Krask. And a fact I should have not to remind you of," Antonidas pointed out, frowning. "If you cannot make time for such duties, perhaps it would be best if another was appointed in your stead." To his surprise, the slender mage bowed his head. "If that is truly what you wish, I will step down," Crassus stated quietly. "I prefer to remain, however, and I promise you that Dalaran and the Kirin Tor currently have my utmost attention." Antonidas studied him a moment, then finally nodded. He didn't really want to lose Crassus. The enigmatic mage had surprising stores of both power and knowledge, and despite the man's occasional evasiveness, Antonidas did feel his colleague had all their best interests at heart. "Take a look at this," he said, thrusting the scroll into the other mage's hands. He watched as Crassus read, shock and growing horror on his face. "The Black Dragonflight," Crassus whispered when he had finished, re-rolling the scroll and placing it carefully on the desk as if the very words might attack. "My research leads me to believe the Red Dragons have no love of battle or bloodshed, and only serve the Horde under duress. But the Black? That pairing seems more logical and deliberate, and much more dangerous." "I agree," Antonidas said. "Crassus, you are one of our resident experts in dragon lore. Do you think there is any way to stop them, or at least limit their effectiveness?" A sharp keening cut through the still night air. The two wizards locked eyes for a moment. They knew what that sound meant. It was an alarm. Crassus stayed silent while Antonidas tried to identify it. Which of the old spells was it? Was it that one, or... "The arcane vault," he said at last, eyes widening. "It's been breached!" Crassus looked as frightened as he felt. The arcane vault stood near the heart of the Violet Citadel and was protected by the strongest magics the Magi could devise. It held many of the city's most powerful artifacts, as well as some items the Magi could not use themselves, but could not risk allowing to fall into the hands of anyone else. Standing, Crassus held out his hand. Antonidas grasped it, and without a word, the two teleported to the arcane vault. The world around them blurred, and book-lined walls of Antonidas' cozy study disappeared to be replaced in a blink, with a large stone chamber. The floor, the walls were roughly hewed from the earth itself, and the ceiling was vaulted. The room had no windows and only one door, except for the space around the lone exit. The rest of the room was lined with shelves and boxes and bookcase, all of them full. Standing amid the dust and the artifacts were several men. At least Antonidas thought they were men. Then his senses detected the rippling black aura around each of them, and even before they turned, revealed glowing eyes gleaming in the shadows of hoods. He knew what matter creatures had perceived their defenses, knew and quelled from that knowledge. Death Knights. Human corpses animated by dead orc warlocks, they reeked of dark power, enough to make Antonidas blanch with horror, enough to pierce even the powerful wards that had been erected here, and so they had come to this highly protected place. For what? This place housed artifacts galore, easily enough weapons for the Death Knights to win the war once and for all, yet they did not move to take the priceless objects. They stood in a circle around a central figure who bore something clutched in his hands. Antonidas concentrated on the item. It was extremely powerful, and the taste of its magic felt familiar, but it wasn't until the lead Death Knight shifted, raising the object he held slightly, and a light reflected off its facets and cast violet rays around the room, and Antonidas realized what single treasure would be great enough for the Death Knights to ignore everything else. "She has the Eye of Dalaran!" Antonidas shouted, raising one hand to cast a mystic bolt, while the other he summoned the rest of the Kirin Tor. Only a handful could fit into the arcane vault, but at least he and Crassus would have reinforcements when they inevitably fell victim to the crushing fatigue that often accompanied a wizardly duel. This is no formal duel, however. Antonidas thought that his mystic bolt caught one of the Death Knights in the torso and slammed the creature into the far wall. Smoke rising from the hole in his chest. One of the other Death Knights raised his truncheon, the jewel along it wrinkling in the candlelight, and Antonidas felt as if something had gripped his heart in ice-cold hands and started to squeeze. He clutched at his chest with both hands, pressing hard to push away the pain that knifed through him. He managed to mutter a spell, and a violet glow sprang around him, dissipating the cold. He could see the attack spell through the mystic senses, looking like a colossal hand shaped from smoke, and slapped the thing away, sending it careening back to its master. The Knight went sprawling. Another of the Kirin Tor teleported in beside him, an elven woman with long black hair. One slender pale hand went to Antonidas' chest, while the other gestured at the terrifying intruders. Antonidas was dimly aware of other figures materializing in the room. He gasped for breath, and as his lungs expanded and his heart beat once more. Blessed warmth flowed through him, even as he saw two Death Knights begin to writhe in pain. Flames suddenly licked at their limbs, torsos, and heads. Two other Death Knights suddenly stepped back. Antonidas' eyes widened in shock as he realized that they were attempting to escape. Distorted shadows cast by the flames of their dying brethren suddenly took on life of their own, wrapping around the Death Knights and absorbing their flesh until they were nothing but wispy memories. Although they would not survive if such a term could be used, the belligerent Death Knights would not go to the death's final embrace alone. Still weak from the attack and his attempt to combat it, Antonidas could do nothing but watch helplessly as two Death Knights turned, their bodies still blazing, and attacked the woman who'd saved Antonidas. Sethra's pale face contorted, her head falling back and her black hair cascading around her like a shroud as air was forced from her lungs. Antonidas heard a crack as the increasing force collapsed her chest and crushed her bones. "Sethra, now!" Antonidas turned to see Prince Kael'thas, his handsome features contorted with rage at the death of his friend and colleague. The elf raised both hands and drew them apart. Across the room, one of the Death Knights jerked and then shrieked as his body was literally torn limb from limb. The slight shock Antonidas back to his senses. "Kael'thas!" he shouted into the tumult as he struggled to his feet. "Kael'thas!" On the second attempt, the elf turned and fixated Antonidas with his powerful stare. "Don't let them teleport!" Antonidas shouted, fending off an attack with one hand by erecting a quick shield upon which the death bolt shattered. The elven prince shook his head as if to clear it, then nodded. He turned his full fury of his gaze upon the intruders and moved his hands to work the spell. The leader snarled at Kael'thas. "Death Knights, to me!" he shouted, holding the eye high above him. The few who remained obeyed, forming a tight circle and facing away from the center to protect him and his prize, even as Kael'thas murmured the incantations and the spell nearly completion. The shadows about the intruders writhed once more, this time taking on a purplish cast as the eyes shed its light all around them, and the Death Knight's form grew in distance. They had escaped with barely a heartbeat to spare. Kael'thas swore in his native tongue. The prey was gone, but they couldn't be followed and tapped at their second location. Antonidas murmured a teleportation incantation, adjusting it slightly so that he would rematerialize in the same place as the Death Knights in an instant. Antonidas found himself standing in a wide balcony he recognized as one of Violet Citadel's upper floors. The Death Knights were all clustered together off to one side, their leader standing proud and tall among them, the eye in his mailed hand. Crassus, Kael'thas, and others followed. This time, Kael'thas and Antonidas were prepared. The spells already in their minds and on their tongues, and they were successful. The Death Knight leader whirled to give Antonidas a baneful stare, and the Archmage prevented himself a slight smile. You are swifter in the vault, but we are swifter here. The balcony is warded against your teleportation spells. There's nowhere to run, Antonidas called out, staring right at the Death Knight leader. They would now be able to capture or kill the Death Knights, keeping one alive for information. Then they would know a good deal more about the new Horde's leader and their plans. Perhaps, the lead Death Knight said softly, his words carrying nonetheless. But why should we run when we can fly? At his words, a wind sprang up behind him from past the balcony, strong enough to make Antonidas stagger. A whistling noise accompanied it, growing louder and louder. Then a piece of the night sky dropped down alongside the balcony. The darkness slowly divided into several long, strenuous forms that hovered in the air just past the balcony's railing, their cruel eyes staring out of their gleaming black faces. Antonidas could already feel his heart beat at him, the heat beating at him, and his shirt was quickly soaked with sweat. Foolish human! Did you believe we had come alone? The Death Knight leader said, laughing. The largest dragon Antonidas had ever seen, swooping in closer to the balcony until its long barbed chin rested over the railing. Antonidas saw Crassus go pale and caught a single whispered word. The Deathwing. At the sound of his name, the mighty dragon swiveled its head and fixed Crassus with an intense gaze. The mage did not cringe from that scrutiny, but Antonidas staggered. Deathwing? Here? The Death Knight stepped onto the railing and then across to Deathwing's back. I have what I came for. Let us be off. Antonidas recovered enough to hurl a lightning bolt at the fleeting figures, but it bounced off their shields. Teleporting was out of the question. They were now moving too quickly and too closely together. Kael'thas and the other Magi shook their heads. They were simply not fast enough to strike at the Death Knights without possibly hitting and angering a dragon that would happily incinerate the entire citadel. As if to punctuate that threat, two of the dragons flanking Deathwing suddenly flew closer, opening their mouths wide. The Magi could barely put up their shields in time. Streams of molten red and gold burst from their wide jaws, striking the balcony and igniting curtains and scrolls in the room behind them. Antonidas cursed under his breath as he watched the other Death Knights climb onto the dragon's back and then soar up into the sky, disappearing from view. He knew the mighty creatures would tear right through the wards he had erected had he never built them to withstand giants. Antonidas felt a stab of despair. He and the rest of the Kirin Tor were charged with protecting the city and its people, and tonight they had failed them. He had always said that every mage should know his limits, and tonight Antonidas knew he had met his. He stared up into the sky, searching for any sign of the invaders, but they were gone, and they had the Eye of Darlaron, one of the city's most powerful artifacts. I have what I came for, the Death Knight had said. Antonidas knew what. The question was why. Chapter 12. Fenris stared up at the clearly old edifice, confused. He had not been sure what to expect from the tomb of Sargeras, but it was not this. What he had at first thought were carvings were in fact the shells and bones and spines of various sea creatures attached to the building's outer walls from years of submersion. It was like seeing the bottom of a deep ocean, only rised up onto land and fashioned into a habitable structure. And the door to this odd building hung wide open. "Where is this artifact? Where is that artifact awaits?" Fenris asked, frowning. He was having a hard time reconciling the place's lumpy appearance with the earth-shattered item Ner'zhul had said would be here. The Death Knight had no such doubts, however. "It's here," Ragnarok insisted. "I can sense it deep within." "Let us go!" Tagar shouted. "Why are we standing around? The sooner we go in, the sooner we come back out." Fenris often found himself at odds with the Bone Chewer chieftain, but he was right on that count. Fenris was anxious to be done with this job of courier. He signaled to his orcs and they followed. Ragnarok, Tagar, and Tagar's Bone Chewer warriors inside. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs that the buildings had spent hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years underwater. Edges and corners were rounded, both from constant friction with the water and from moss and coral and shells that attached themselves there. The floor was covered with mold and seaweed. Any decorations along the wall were either destroyed by all those years in the water or covered by just as many years of acclimation. Here and there, some water had remained pooled and was now long since stagnated. No light penetrated here. The strange buildings had no windows, but that was not a concern. Ragnarok raised his hand, and a burst of yellowish illumination appeared above him. It cast disturbing shadows about the corridor, but at least allowed them to move steadily inward. As they progressed deeper, Fenris noticed that the walls here were cleaner than they had been near the entrance, and not just less grubby, but less degraded. The carvings and decoration that decorated every surface had not been worn away to the same degree, and he caught glimpses here and there of what this temple must have been at its height. It would have been magnificent, filled with beauty and elegance he had never even imagined possible, and Fenris felt rough and bestial treading its halls. He could see that the rest of his clan felt the same way. Tagar and his Bone Chewer orcs seemed unaffected by the temple's beauty, but they had seemed to have little appreciation for anything beyond death and destruction. Ragnarok appeared utterly focused on the task at hand, which might have been why it was Tagar who suddenly stopped and pointed at a spot on the wall near where it met the floor. "Look there!" the Bone Chewer chieftain said. Fenris followed his gesture and saw a smear of something dark across the carving. It looked like blood, Tagar confirmed. He knelt by the smear, sniffing at it, and then touched his tongue to it. "Orc blood," he clarified, raising to his feet again. "Several years old." "The blood of Gul'dan or his warlocks," Ragnarok said. "We are getting close." It was not a pleasant thought, even if it did mean that at the end of their quest was at hand. "Be on guard," Fenris said to his orcs, and they nodded somberly. "Are you scared, Fenris?" Tagar mocked, stepping up and shoving his face close to Fenris's. "Afraid of what we might find?" "Of course I am, you idiot!" Fenris snapped, his tusks scraping the younger chieftain's cheeks. "Gul'dan was a traitor and a fool, but he was still the most powerful warlock the Horde had ever seen, and something in here killed him and his followers. You'd have to be insane or stupid not to be afraid." "Well, I'm not afraid," Tagar replied, drawing smiles and laughs from several of Fenris's warriors. Fenris himself just shook his head and wondered yet again why he'd been sent with such an idiot. But that's why he answered himself. Because someone has to be smart enough to know what to do and win, and someone else had to be foolish enough to go on anyway, even when it was near suicide. "Fine," Fenris said, allowing himself a small grin. "You go first. Then." Tagar smiled and whooped his war cry, echoing down the hall. He strode forward, leading the way without a moment's concern. The others followed. The condition of the walls and floor continued to improve as they ascended further into the temple. Its glory was breathtaking. At one intersection of corridors, Ragnar stopped, apparently confused. He turned first one way, then another. Fenris frowned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. The Death Knight hesitated again, then nodded to himself and strode firmly down one of the halls. Fenris shook his head, but followed. The hall ended in a wide room. The walls here were blank, surprisingly enough, clean and smooth and bare, and the sudden contrast made the room seem stark and dignified. At the far end, a massive vault door of plain black iron filled most of the wall. "This is it," Ragnar breathed. He swung the door open and froze in utter terror. Beyond the door lay an almost impenetrable darkness, as if night had been condensed and hidden here where the light would never find it. Standing in that darkness just past the door was a creature from a nightmare. It towered over them, standing so tall it was forced to hunch within the room beyond. Its skin was scaled and covered in bumps and seemed to ripple, as if somehow its surface was fluid like water. Spikes jutted from its shoulders, the forearms, the chest, and various other places. The overlonged arms ended in huge hands with long claws. Its face was too narrow at the bottom and too wide at the top, with slanted eyes that glowed a smoky, rolling yellow, and a tiny mouth somehow filled with insane number of razor-sharp teeth. A long tail whipped about behind it. In one of its clawed hands it held a long rod, almost a spear with a wooden haft and worked silver ends. The top of its massive spikes clustered around a large gem that glowed with a bright white light of its own, and it was that radiance that held the darkness in the tomb partly at bay. Small flickers of lightning burst from the gem as well, only to fade into the darkness again. The Scepter of Sargeras, the artifact Ner'zhul had sent them to retrieve. All they had to do was take it from what Fenris absolutely sure was a demon. "You will not pass," the demon hissed, its voice rolling over them in oily waves. "This tomb has already been defiled by mortals once. It shall not happen again." "We don't want to pass," Fenris replied, biting back the fear and bile that leapt up in his throat. "We just want that scepter you're waving about." The demon laughed, a low cackle like bone grating on bone, and stepped forward, its long clawed feet digging deep furrows into the marble floor. "Then you may take it from me," it offered. "And after you fail, you'll shed your bones and sup on your souls." "I'll crack your bones in my teeth and drink out the marrow," Hagar bellowed back at the demon. This was the kind of language he understood. Then he charged, his axe held high. And though he cursed Tagar for a fool and himself for a worse one, Fenris raised his own weapon and leaped into the fray beside his fellow chieftain. The other 30 or so Thunderlord and Bone Chewer warriors were right behind them. Even so, it was a difficult battle. The demon was strong, stronger than any one of them by far, and faster as well. Its long claws cleft skin and bone and muscle with ease, tearing through the orcs as if they were dried leaves. The scepter it held was heavy enough to crush an orc's skull without taking a dent. Even the demon's tail was a weapon. Tagar shrieked in outrage as the creature struck one of the bone chewers with it. The long barb at the end went easily through the hapless orc's chest and emerged dripping blood from his back. But the worst, most frightening attack it possessed was its bite. The unbelievable mouth stretched wider than it should have physically been possible, exposing row upon row of teeth. Fenris watched the demon bite off half a warrior's head, and even though his own battle rage, he felt sick. It was that battle rage that saved him. Under normal circumstances, Fenris disapproved of the bloodlust, but now it was a boon. Without it, many of the orcs, including himself, would have run away in abject terror. But with their heads pounding and their visions blurred and their blood humming, they attacked and continued to attack. Yes, the demon was faster, but with so many warriors attacking on each new assault, a few hits got through. The demon was stronger, but severing its limbs still crippled it. At last, the demon's tail and one At last, with the demon's tail and one arm and part of a leg gone, the other arm so shattered it wreathed like a snake, Fenris and Tagar struck as one, their axes slicing to his thick neck. The blows came from opposite sides, delivered with all the force their respective masters could muster, and both chieftains took thin cuts along their forefingers where the other's blade had nicked. But the demon toppled to the ground, its neck cut clean through both sides. The head landed at Ragnarok's feet. Fenris bent down and picked up the scepter. It was lighter than he expected, but he could feel a faint thrum of power through it. "We have what we were sent for," he said, turning back. "Let's go!" What? Surprisingly, it was Ragnarok who protested. "But this is the tomb of Sargeras, and you just killed its guardian." "That was one guardian," Fenris replied. "There will be others, you mark my words." He held the scepter up so it caught the light. "Fortunately, we don't have to go any deeper into this pit." "You don't understand," Ragnar continued. He stepped close to Fenris. "We got the scepter. We should get the eye of Sargeras as well. Do you remember when it was confused earlier? It was because I sensed both artifacts. It took me a moment to realize what was going on, but I know exactly where the Eye of Sargeras is now. Down that other corridor. That was the artifact Gul'dan sought, and now it's within our grasp." Ragnarok's glowing eyes narrowed in fury. "Pitiful things. I could destroy you with a mere touch. You will come with me to retrieve the eye, or what?" Fenris spat. "Go ahead, kill us where we stand, and go back alone for the eye. Either way, we will be dead." He was mostly sure that the Death Knight was bluffing, but he stood by his decision. Ragnarok might kill them in a fit of anger, but whatever was sure to be guarding the eye was most definitely kill them. Ragnarok lifted his hands for a moment. Fenris' heart stopped, but then the Death Knight sagged. He had been bluffing after all. "You are fools," Ragnarok growled, but his voice was laced with defeat. "Maybe," Fenris agreed, "but we are fools who will live to see another day." Without another word, he turned. His clan followed him, as did Tagar and his orcs. It was only with the smallest satisfaction that a few moments later he noticed that Ragnarok had again joined them. "Do you have it?" Fenris dismounted, sliding off the dragon's back and planting both feet solidly on the cracked ground that met Gorfin's stare as the Death Knight hurried toward them. The dragons had been waiting for the orcs when their boats had reached land again, and had quickly carried them back to the blasted lands to rejoin Gorfin and the others. "Yes, we have it," Fenris confirmed, holding up the long cloth-wrapped scepter. He handed it to Gorfin, happy to be rid of it. "What now?" "We make our way back through the portal," Gorfin answered. Fenris suppressed a shudder as Gorfin's hand closed around the bundle protectively. "Our tasks here are finished. Azeroth is no longer important to us. We will leave this world to the humans and their allies. And good riddance." Fenris started to ask for more detail, but a loud rumbling stopped him. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw several large carts rolling into the valley, orcs guiding each one. Remembering the discussion back in Black Rock Mountains, he realized these must contain the cargo. Deathwing had asked them to allow through the portal. He wondered idly what could be so important the Black Dragon wanted it moved to another world, but resigned himself to likely never knowing. Another orc, though, was more curious than Fenris. He started to approach one of the carts before Fenris could even draw breath to shout a warning. A dark shape swooped from the sky. The orc screamed and dropped to the ground, clutching at his face. Blood dripped from between his fingers. "Get back!" Fenris cried. "Stay away from the carts!" The dragon that had borne the orcs here now took to the skies to defend the cargo, some of them not waiting to make sure their riders had completely dismounted. "Gorfind!" came a voice Fenris recognized. That scream could only belong to no one other than Warsong chieftain Grom Hellscream. Grom Hellscream had clearly been with the forces harassing the Alliance troops at Netherguard Keep, and had just returned with them. He was still halfway across the valley, but they heard him clearly. "Did you bring those creatures?" "I did," Gorfing replied, not raising his voice, but his words carrying nonetheless. "The Black Dragons are our new ally." Grom ducked as a black dragon's claw slid by dangerously close to his head and scowled. "Some allies!" he shouted. "Do something about your weak friends before they cause a panic or kill us all!" The knight glanced up at the dragon, studying them a moment. Then he nodded. "Deathwing," he called. "I swear to you that I will defend those cards and their cargo. Please pull your dragons back to the valley's edge." Fenris couldn't pick up the dragon elder out among all the shifting, gliding shapes, but a moment later, the dragons wheeled and made for perches along the cliffs, ringing the valley floor. "Better!" Grom grunted, approaching them. He nodded at Fenris, who nodded back. The two of them had always gotten along. Fenris considered Grom one of the finest chieftains in the Horde, and a superb warrior as well. "Did you get what you needed?" Grom asked them both. "I did," Gorfin replied. He didn't say anything further. Grom peered at the carts. "What are those?" "Cargo," Gorfin replied shortly. Each cart was made of sturdy wood beams, had high sides, and was completely covered with a thick tarp. Fenris could see from the way the tarp shifted that the carts were full, but could discern nothing more. "I thought we had to retrieve those were I thought all we had to retrieve were those artifacts," Grom said. "There has been a change of plans," the Death Knight answered. "Nothing to worry about." He raised his voice, and must have worked some magic as well, because suddenly it echoed across the valley. "Those gods are under my personal protection, and anyone who interferes with them or tries to look at them will answer to me." Several orcs glanced up, startled at the two who had been approaching the rear cart, hastily backed away. Fenris shrugged. His task was done, and if Gorfin wanted to play some other game, that was between him and Ner'zhul. "How soon can we get through?" he asked. "I need some of your clan to stay behind and defend the portal for a short time longer. You and the rest of the clan go through now if you like," Gorfind answered. "Tagar, you too. I need some of your bone chewers." Fenris frowned, but nodded. He had hoped all his clan would be allowed to return, but he understood Gorfind's reasoning. "What of us?" Grom was asking Gorfin, but Fenris turned away. The war song's orders were not his concern right now. Instead, he signaled his second, Malgrim Stormhand, and together they selected 12 orcs to stay behind under Malgrim's command. The orcs did not protest. They were Thunderlords. They served the Horde as asked. To the portal! The rest of the Thunderlord clan marched across the valley floor and approached the towering, new dark portal. Just ahead of them were the covered carts, and Fenrir saw several Death Knights detach themselves from the forces positioned around the valley and step beside those mysterious vehicles. Gorfin was there as well, near the front. Fenrir heard Tagar yelling at his bone chewers, trying to divvy them up, and the roars of ogres as they were promised combat. Me smash! One of them cried gleefully. The entire Warsong clan, too, would stay, judging from the comments he heard. The portal would be amply protected. Part of him thought he should remain as well, but another part of him was deeply worried and longed for home. Later, perhaps, he would return with fresh orcs to retrieve those he had stationed here. Fenris hastened up the ramp and faced the dark portal itself. The portal still made him nervous, with its strange rippling energy. It disturbed him that something so small, he could easily walk around the portal. It wasn't even as wide as the thick stone columns framing it. Could be from a bridge between two separate worlds. He kept half expecting the portal to fail somehow, to collapse and tear apart anyone caught within it. The thought made him pick up his pace, and he ran through it, feeling the strange jarring sensation he'd all noticed when he'd left Draenor, as if his body were being shunted a great distance. A cold prickle ran across his skin, and brief flash crossed his eyes. Then he was staring at the familiar red skies of Draenor again. Fenris breathed a sigh of relief and continued on away from the portal, stopping finally to allow the rest of his clan to catch up. Behind him, he saw some of the other clans filling through the well as well, and Gorfin had already departed with those carts. Fenris had done as ordered, and now he would simply wait until Ner'zhul had new instructions for him. Until then, the Thunderlord warriors would return to their home. He had had enough of an intriguing and deception and plotting to last him a long time.